Bonjour tout le monde. This is meeting 33 of the Standing Committee on Environment and Sustainable Development. For those in person, please remember to follow the health and safety guidelines as per the cards on your table to prevent audio or feedback incidents. Today, we are doing an additional session studying our report on the electric vehicle availability standard. And we have witnesses from various government departments here today. Thank you so much for being here with us. We have Benoit Tessier, Director General, Automotive Transportation and Industrial Skills Branch from the Department of Industry. We have Mark Cauchi, Director General, Energy and Transportation of the Environmental Protection Branch from the Department of Environment and Climate Change Canada. And we have Anna Vanderkamp, the Executive Director of Decarbonization Programs from the Department of Natural Resources. So to begin, every witness will have 5 minutes to give an opening statement. I do have a card giving you a 1-minute warning, and then when your time is up, if that is helpful. And after all three have given their comments, we will go to questions from committee members. So let's begin with Monsieur Tessier. The floor is yours.
Bonjour, members du comité. Thank you, Madam Chair. And
good morning, committees.
Pleasure to appear today to discuss the Government of Canada's actions to support the automotive sector and the workers who are the foundation of this industry. Depuis plus d'un siècle, l'industrie automobile canadienne est...
For more than a century, the Canadian automotive industry and its dedicated workforce has been a mainstay of the Canadian economy.
To Canada's gross domestic product and supported more than 120,000 direct jobs across the country. It remains, of course, one of Canada's largest export industries. Excuse me. Earlier this year, the government launched Canada's automotive strategy to protect the industry in the face of trade disruptions and to position it to become a global leader in next-generation vehicle manufacturing. While ISED is mainly responsible for the Strategic Response Fund component of the auto strategy, I can summarize the strategy in my remarks, but will suggest that specific questions related to each element be directed to appropriate departments. Cette stratégie trace la voie à suivre.
The strategy sets out the path forward for a sector that is becoming more and more electrified and competitive on a global scale. It aims to protect manufacturers operating in Canada and their supply chains while attracting new investment.
An allocation of up to $3 billion through the Strategic Response Fund and up to $100 million through the Regional Tariff Response Initiative to support both large-scale projects and small and medium-sized enterprises across the automotive supply chain. The government is also seeking to strengthen the automotive duty remission framework to better align trade policy with industrial objectives, while maintaining counter tariffs on U.S. vehicle imports for as long as necessary to protect Canadian workers and manufacturers. Au cœur de la stratégie,
At the heart of the strategy, and particularly relevant for this committee, is the long-term certainty it provides regarding the trajectory of emissions reductions from light-duty vehicles.
Greenhouse gas emission standards for light-duty vehicles for model years 2027 to 2032, as well as repeal the electric vehicle availability standard in order to provide a more flexible, outcome-based approach that supports emission reduction in a technology-neutral manner, enabling industry to adapt to market conditions and consumer demand. To support electric vehicle adoption, the Government of Canada has launched a new 5-year electric vehicle affordability program. This program provides up to $5,000 for battery electric and fuel cell vehicles and up to $2,500 for plug-in hybrid vehicles, helping to make zero-emission vehicles more accessible to Canadian families and businesses. In parallel, the Government of Canada will develop a national charging infrastructure strategy supported by a $1.5 billion investment through the Canada Infrastructure Bank. This initiative seeks to accelerate the deployment of charging infrastructure, leverage private sector investment, and ensure Canadians have reliable access to charging across the country. Taking together, these measures are aiming to support an automotive sector that is competitive, resilient, and aligned with Canada's environmental and economic objectives. Merci et au plaisir de...
Thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you, Mr. Tessier.
Mr. Cauchi, for 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Vice Chairs, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. Monsieur le Président, Mesdames et Messieurs, Vice-Présidents et membres.
The Chair, ladies and gentlemen, Vice Chairs, thank you for the opportunity to appear for you today.
Gathered on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. I am pleased to be here with colleagues from across the government to discuss the auto strategy that the Government of Canada has announced and the approach we are taking to reduce emissions from the transportation sector while supporting jobs, investment, and affordability for Canadians. While transportation is central to Canadians' daily lives and to our economy, it is also one of the largest sources of greenhouse gases and air pollutant emissions. This gives us an opportunity. Le défi auquel nous faisons face n'est...
The challenge that we're faced with is not to know if changes will affect the automobile sector. They're already happening at a global scale. But how Canada manages this transition in a way that maintains auto sector competitiveness while enabling Canadian drivers to have access to the most innovative, affordable, and clean vehicles technologies possible.
Practicality, Canadians expect environmental policies to deliver results in the real world, not just on paper. And Canada's auto strategy is grounded in a simple principle, focus on outcomes that matter to Canadians while giving industry the flexibility it needs to succeed in a rapidly changing global market. This means three things. Premièrement, s'assurer que les Canadiens ont...
First of all, ensuring that Canadians have access to clean, affordable transportation options. Secondly, reducing emissions in a real and measurable way. And thirdly, supporting a competitive, resilient automotive sector that provides good jobs and reduces unnecessary red tape.
Following extensive consultations, the Prime Minister announced in 2026 that we will repeal the electric vehicle availability standard and strengthen Canada's light-duty greenhouse gas performance standards for new vehicles and make them sovereign. This is not a retreat from climate ambition. It is a move toward a simpler and more coherent and more effective regulatory framework. By focusing on performance-based standards, Canada is setting clear and achievable expectations for emission reductions while remaining technology neutral, and it is expected to drive increased zero-emission vehicle sales as the standard becomes more stringent. The outcome is clear. Emissions must come down. What remains flexible is how industry gets there. An informed and rational policy approach recognizes the need for increased flexibility for everyone, especially in the context of the current tariff situation and the price volatility of oil and gas, while still moving decisively towards lower emissions. Automakers will have the flexibility in how they comply through battery electric vehicles, hybrid technologies, including both plug-in hybrids and conventional hybrids, and increasingly efficient internal combustion vehicles. What they cannot do is avoid reducing emissions further. This will be non-negotiable. Cette approche place le Canada sur une trajectoire crédible.
This approach sets Canada on a credible path towards approximately 75% electric vehicle sales by 2035, with an aspirational target of 90% by 2040.
Automakers, while still positioning us to continue reducing emissions on a pathway to net zero by 2050. In short, it's a win-win. As many of you know, Canada's auto sector employs nearly 500,000 people and contributes billions of dollars annually to our economy at a time when the sector is facing global competition, trade pressures, and rapid technological change. Competitiveness matters, and so does affordability. 1 in 4 new vehicles sold globally is now an electric vehicle, and that share is rising. Many Canadians want cleaner, more efficient vehicles, but cost and practicality remain a consideration. That is why regulatory measures are being complemented by a broader national auto strategy developed in collaboration with Transport Canada, Natural Resources Canada, and ISED in an effort to create supportive policies for consumers and industry. These include the renewal of federal purchase incentives of up to $5,000, investments to expand charging infrastructure, and actions to increase access to a wider range of lower-cost electric vehicles. Thank you. I look forward to the committee's questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cauchi, for your testimony. We will now move to Ms. Vanderkamp. The floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Merci pour l'occasion de présenter. I'd like to present
Thank you for the opportunity to present.
Availability and convenience for charging for Canadians in both rural and urban areas. As you know, the vast majority of charging is going to happen at home when a car is sitting idle for several hours, generally overnight at a home. This is generally provided what's called level 2 charging that takes about 8 hours or so to recharge a battery and should serve actually 80 to 90% of charging needs of the average Canadian, even in a rural area where they may travel 60, 70 kilometers as compared to a urban daily travel, which is only about 30 to 40 kilometers. So the average range for an EV now is 450 kilometers, and that's enough for daily travel, even in the coldest winter. DC fast charging or level 3 charging generally only takes 15 to 30 minutes now to charge an EV, and that's used for the occasional long trip of maybe over 400 kilometers a day. And these are placed at highways, yes, but also at town centers, like a grocery store or a fast food restaurant. The idea is to place them in convenient places where you would already want to stop for 10 to 15 minutes. NRCan has mapped every square populated kilometer in Canada and every major travel corridor to estimate the expected demand 2 years out based on many factors. And I'd like to give you some highlights of our findings. With respect to daily travel for EV owners, drivers in rural areas actually should be okay. But with respect to corridors, we see gaps in those northern and remote regions. In urban areas, with respect to daily travel, there's actually serious gaps. But in most cities, the main corridors around them are fine. So the issue in urban areas is that many don't have access to home charging. 1/3 of Canadians live in multi-unit residential buildings, and the vast majority of those buildings don't have charging. If you have a single-family home with a parking spot, it's feasible to install a charger. That costs about $1,500. And I would note that the new proposed regulatory approach is technology neutral, and so more Canadians in rural areas are going to purchase plug-in hybrids or conventional hybrids that actually require even less charging, if any at all. But for those living in apartment buildings or condos, it can be prohibitive, costing between $2,500 and $10,000 to have charging installed in your space. But there's many other barriers. So we need to consider the Canadians that don't have private private parking spots at all. Another important part is affordability. Level 2 charging is by far the cheapest, especially at home. In Canada, on average, if you can just charge at home, this will only cost about $700 a year. You can recuperate that charger in a year. As a point of reference, filling a tank of gas is at about $1.50 would be over $3,000 a year. Level 3 charging is the most expensive. The average cost currently is about 42 cents a kilowatt hour. And if this is your sole source of charging, that'll cost you about $2,000 annually, 3 times as much as charging at home. There is another option, which is level 2 public charging. This could be at a community center, a restaurant, or hopefully where you work, somewhere where your car is going to sit for a few hours. And if you only had to rely on this charging, that would be about $1,200. So the point is, level 2 charging at home or at work is fundamentally cheaper and more convenient for Canadians. And the amount of public charging that's required is dependent on how much private charging we have. So in Canada, we have around 700,000 private chargers and just under 40,000 public chargers, but over 30,000 of those public chargers are those level 2 chargers. So public charging is concentrated, as we can see, where there is demand. However, I would note that those areas that have the highest demand still actually have the highest capacity gaps. We need a basic level of charging for service for public charging for sure. But the real underserved areas in 2 years will continue to be urban and suburban areas with high density housing and remote corridors. So to reiterate, that private level 2 charging should be favored, and access to private charging impacts how much public charging we need. I like to think of that level 3 charging that most people are concerned about as the tip of the iceberg above the water. The real issue is below the water, those level 2 chargers. So given all these complexities, that's why the government is committed to put together this national charging infrastructure strategy as part of the auto strategy. That will bring together the Canadian ecosystem to address top barriers and attract more private sector investment, which is going to be necessary to meet demand. Private investment in charging is dependent on how much revenue can be generated. And currently, only the sites with high traffic areas are getting the utilization rates that attract significant private investment. The Zero Emission Vehicle Infrastructure Program that I manage is designed to support charging where it is needed, but also where it's challenging to attract private investment. To date, a large percentage of our funds have gone to those multi-unit residential buildings, and I would note that our last 2 calls for project proposals were focused on filling the gaps in Canada's charging infrastructure in rural and remote areas. Thank you.
We will now move to questions from committee members, and we will begin with Mr. Leslie for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to direct, I think, most to ECCC, but if it's somebody better, please just step in. Have the EV mandate regulations been officially repealed?
So the mandate regulations are in the process of being repealed, so they have not been legally repealed. That will require a publication in Canada Gazette, and we are in the process of developing that repeal document for Governor and Council approval.
Now, in lieu of this, the Liberals are set to announce tougher tailpipe rules. If those rules are set high enough, is this not just a rebranded EV forced mandate program?
Yeah, we are not implementing a sales mandate. The direction we've been given by the government is to develop GHG performance standards. These are performance standards that were put in place originally in Canada in 2010 by the Harper government. These standards are technology neutral. They do not apply to or require sales of any particular kind of vehicle. The stringency, however, of those standards will be set at a level that will definitely drive increased efficiency.
Will it also drive a higher cost for the manufacturer?
So I think we're going to be releasing our cost-benefit analysis on that. I would say there's pretty clear evidence that technology-neutral GHG performance standards are lower cost, and I think the industry has now gone on record to say that they support the government's announcement.
So there seems to be a lot of details lacking. What is the anticipated timeline? Is the regulations finalized on your end? When are they planning to be gazetted? Are you talking about 2027? That's under 9 months away. Manufacturers are going to have to make adjustments to abide by these new regulations. So what does this timeline look like?
Yeah, so the regulations are in place right now for the 2026 model year. The government is going to publish the revised regulations by the end of the year.
So how would a manufacturer for the 2027 model year, as outlined in the plan, make those adjustments necessary if they don't know the regulations?
So as the Prime Minister announced on February 5th, the existing regulations remain in place for 2026, the GHG performance standards. The stringency for next year, which the Prime Minister also stated, is the same as this year. So the auto sector does have some certainty, as to what those regulations look like and what the stringency.
So they don't actually start in 2027. I can probably buy a 2027 in like a month. Like they come out quite a bit earlier. So it's actually 2028 model year.
Legal obligations will apply for the 2027 model year, the new stringency, and running out until 2032. But the existing regulations are in place now.
Will these be, you mentioned 2010, that was a harmonization with the United States. My expectation is we are going to be deharmonizing with the United States and having more stringent tailpipe emissions requirements. What impact is that going to have on the cost for manufacturers? What impact is it going to have in terms of availability of models that may not be able to come in here, and most importantly, perhaps, with the ongoing and upcoming CUSMA negotiations and the government's seemingly lack of auto strategy, what does the collaboration look like in terms of trade negotiations? What impact, if we don't maintain harmony with tailpipe emissions with the United States, is that going to have on availability and cost for Canadian consumers?
So a couple of things on that point. While CUSMA definitely is in the mix here, and we've seen a long history of alignment in Canada, I would say that the air pollution regulations that Canada has right now on vehicles will remain aligned with those of the United States. Those are kind of critical alignment areas. Those include test cycles, so there will be a consistency of test cycles across the border in Canada and the U.S., so they will be identical, remain identical. Most of the vehicles that are electric vehicles are being actually imported from outside the U.S., so about 80% of EVs are coming from jurisdictions outside the U.S.
I'm talking non-EV vehicles.
And non-EV, so the technology neutral performance standard does not require a specific type of vehicle to be sold. OEMs will have the choice as to what vehicles they bring for sale into Canada. So
it's reasonable to think that it's going to reduce the number of models coming into the country. We're a smaller market than the United States. That's our predominant interaction with in terms of manufacturing. So it's reasonable to believe less models from less manufacturers are going to make their way in here if they could just sell more cars in the United States that have lower tailpipe emissions. That was the point of harmonization back in 2010, if I recall correctly. It was another time, I would say. So 2010 and now are very different times. We see a much more efficient fleet both in Canada and the U.S. We also see state level requirements remaining in place in the United States, and so about 40% of the U.S. auto market is under some sort of state level regulation, which is also going to drive the fleet. Are you building? My main concern is: are you building this in a silo? Is the international trade and the international auto strategy involvement, the cross-border manufacturing, is that being considered as you develop this gazetted processed regulations?
Well, absolutely. I think that was the impetus for the announcement the government made originally around shifting to this type of regulation, which the industry has called for.
Thank you very much, Mr. Leslie. We will now turn to Mr. Greaves for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, colleagues, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. Given some of the recent events obviously occurring in the world, we understand what a difficult time it is for manufacturers, but also for Canadian consumers, whether that's the spike in oil prices due to the crisis in the Strait of Hormuz caused by the United States and Iran, whether that's the trade war that's been thrust on us by the United States. But I'd rather focus my questions on some of the domestic aspects and the domestic benefits that flow from higher rates of EV adoption. In my riding of Victoria, for example, transportation-related emissions account for around 50% of air pollution in our entire region, and some communities in Canada have even higher rates. Health Canada estimates that traffic-related air pollution contributes to around 1,200 premature deaths annually across the country. I'm wondering if we could discuss, and Mr. Cauchi, I'll start with you perhaps, what are the health benefits for Canadians of these newly strengthened GHG standards, and how will they, therefore benefit in terms of their long-term health outcomes and reducing strain on our public health care system?
Sure. Appreciate the question. Certainly, the evidence is well documented. I believe Health Canada has put out some fairly compelling evidence regarding the costs of air pollution from vehicles into Canada, to our healthcare system, and to Canadians as individuals. I think those have been monetized at about $9.5 billion annually. We know that electric vehicles and more efficient vehicles with pollution controls on them do reduce the exposure of Canadians to harmful air pollution. So it is not just a carbon dioxide issue. It is we're talking about things like NOx, PM 2.5, ultrafine particulates, et cetera. So we definitely see there will be a gain, obviously, for Canadians at the local level in terms of lower asthma rates, lower instances of cardiovascular and cardiopulmonary disease. That is fairly well documented globally. And so a shift to electrification is certainly good for the health of Canadians.
Thank you for that. In a similar vein, it's certainly public health and safety related. I think one of the perhaps less discussed aspects of vehicle adoption, of EV, adoption, also has to do with increased safety for all road users, given the lighter mass of electric vehicles. As battery technology has become more and more sophisticated, we've seen more not only energy efficient EVs entering the market, but lighter vehicles, which then might have corresponding benefits for road safety and for, as I say, all road users. Is that something that you could also comment on, Mr. Cauchi?
I think it depends a lot on obviously the vendor, the manufacturer, the importer, and the type of vehicles. So yeah, we certainly are seeing improvements in technology, improvements in safety. I think in the early years of EV adoption, we did see some concerns about safety issues. Those are definitely in decline, and we see obviously a much broader range of weights and vehicle types being deployed. I think we're well over 100 models, EV models now available in Canada. So yeah, I think I would defer, though, the question around safety to Transport Canada, who is responsible for vehicle safety. Is probably not something I should get too far down
Fair enough.
In the weeds on.
Fair enough. Switching gears slightly, I'll direct my next question to Ms. Vanderkamp, but if any of the other witnesses would like to respond, please feel free afterwards. I'd like to just drill in on what are the estimated cost savings for the average Canadian household, given the increased cost of fuel and given the market price of EVs now. Can you give us a sense of what the long-term economic benefits to households would be of switching to an EV and saving for themselves those high costs of fuel that we're seeing at the pumps?
Yeah, thank you very much. As I had mentioned, on average in Canada, I mean, electricity rates vary, of course, across the country, so it really is a regional issue. Mm-hmm. On average, you would probably only be spending about $800 to charge your EV at home, if you could do that all the time, whereas filling a gas car right now, a conventional ICE car, at about $1.50, and that's also varying, of course, across the country, is about $3,000. So that gives you the savings annually that you would get.
Yeah, right now the price of gas in Victoria is around $2.15, so $1.50 sounds pretty good.
Yeah.
You also, in your comments, Ms. Vanderkamp, discussed, the difference between dense urban regions and more suburban, and then also remote and, in some cases, rural regions. Do you have any sense of what the different cost savings would be for Canadians living in those types of communities? Are remote drivers who obviously have much longer distances to cover going to gain more savings from EV adoption as a result of their longer commutes?
Yeah, that adds up for certain when you're discussing the level 2 charging at home. If you have to do extremely long distances and you do rely on some public charging, then it could be somewhere in between because, as I said, public charging is more expensive, also extremely dependent on the province, actually. So that depends on where you live. It does go anywhere from 32 cents a kilowatt hour up to 65 cents a kilowatt hour. So, but I would say for the most part, even folks in rural areas that will have home charging will benefit more.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Greaves. Maintenant, je passe la parole à Monsieur Simard pour...
Mr. Simard, you have the floor for 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I wanted to make sure before starting that our witnesses can hear the interpretation. Is it working? Excellent. Mr. Cauchi and Mr. Tessier, I'm surprised of what you said in your opening statement, because both of you said that there is flexibility for the industry. There's a possibility of making the automobile sector more competitive, more resilient, an approach that's focused on results. And I'd like to know what you think of this. It leaves me the impression that the government standards are dictated more by the needs of industry than by a willingness to decrease GHGs. So I'm on the Natural Resources Committee. With carbon pricing, there are several people who were saying that we have to have a certain predictability in order to adopt changes in technology. And what we do with the EVs, that we've just scrapped that predictability, because you're changing all of the standards for industry, and you're acting in a maybe a complacent way. The crisis that we're experiencing is not permanent. At some point, Mr. Trump will no longer be president. So this crisis is not a permanent crisis, and you're adjusting. I understand that. But as a function of a problem that is permanent, which is climate change. So each of you has to have some indicators. If we had kept the former standards in place, which would have increased the availability of EVs, we would have a certain result on our emissions in 2030, 2050. If those standards are changed and are implemented in different ways with objectives that are less ambitious, it means that in 2030 or 2050, obviously, inevitably, we will be having different GHG emissions. Do you have the information, and if so, could you provide it to the committee? Thank you for the question. The ECCC has modeled the impact of this decision, of this announcement. It's a preliminary modeling, but it's important to recognize that the regulation that was implemented, that exists now, or the regulations that are in place, have given important environmental results, including a GHG reduction by more than 50% for each vehicle on average. That's really important. I want to make sure I'm understanding what you're saying. You're saying the results with the current regulation on performance for the
that exist now since 2010 have achieved an emissions improvement and an improvement in efficiency of vehicles by more than 50% on average.
Donc en reculant sur certaines normes qui obligeaient l'industrie à fournir.
Decreasing some standards that
going to increase the stringency of those existing regulations. I think the Prime Minister has indicated the government's intent to double the stringency of the existing regulations. So we will see additional improvements and reductions of greenhouse gases. We will also see increased sales of electric vehicles and conventional hybrids, plug-in hybrids as well. So the modeling that we have conducted
J'ai un peu de misère à vous suivre, pardon.
I'm having trouble following what you're saying. If I look at the figures on EVs that are available in Europe costing less than $40,000, there are 20 such models under $40,000. There's only one in Canada, just one type of EV at that price. If we want to increase the fleet of EVs, we have to make sure we have EVs at an affordable cost. So I have the impression that we're not putting pressure on the industry to provide these vehicles because we're reducing the stringency of the rules. And also we're blocking access to European vehicles, which we could easily receive here and which would decrease our GHG emissions in an important way. I have nothing against the automobile sector, but we have to speak frankly to the population. So I'm looking at with a kind of a falling back. So it seems that we have to put our foot on the brake of the electrification of transportation because things are more complex with the crisis tariff from the U.S. So this obviously has an impact on GHG reduction. We can talk about that later. Thank you, Mr. Simard.
Mr. Ross, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for your presence and your presentations. My question is to Mr. Tessier. Can you describe your role in the deal between the federal government and Northvolt for a $7 billion battery facility in Quebec?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question. So essentially, the Ministry of Industry, I said, is responsible for some programs. The SIF program, as you will recall, was in place at the time of the negotiation with some of the battery companies. And as you will also recall, the federal government had offered a subsidy through that program that was never ratified between the federal government and the company. So essentially, we, at the end of the day...
But your role, I'm asking your role.
Well, my personal role is the policy work behind the auto sector in general, so I'm advising my colleagues in the program that are managing the program that are providing those subsidies.
Okay, thank you. Well, in September 2023, the government announced that it would provide $1.3 billion in capital commitment toward the project, and not even a year later, Northvolt was declared insolvent in September 2025, ending this proposed gigafactory outside of Montreal. Did the government know that this was an unstable company to begin with? And if so, why did they invest this money?
Yeah, well, thank you again. So the government did a due diligence and risk assessment on the company for sure, and for that reason had some very specific mitigation measures in place. Among other things, we did not.
Excuse me, just before I lose the note. So there was a mitigation assessment done. Was there any red flags to show that this might not be a good investment, given that the assessment was done? Was there anything there?
Well, at the time, it's a few years ago. At the time, the sector was booming. That particular company was still successful and was hoping to establish in North America. And competing, Canada was competing with other jurisdictions.
So is it safe to say that the government looked at this in terms of a healthy company, that they were speculating that this would be a good economy, a good market, and a good company, as opposed to actually looking at the financial stability or the viability of the company itself? Is it safe to say that?
Well, I think it's safe to say that the unfolding of events after the fact, if you rewind the history.
I get all that. I'm just talking about the viability of the company itself. There was an assessment done that didn't talk about the emerging markets or what's possible. I mean, anybody can do that. I mean, we're really talking about the financial health and the viability of the company itself. So the assessment didn't raise any flags in that respect.
I think that's what I'm trying to say, is that at the time of that negotiation, which was before all of this happened with the company, there was certainly some risk with any deal, any investment, but it was deemed mitigated in order for us to make an offer. But I will repeat the fact that we did not, never signed an agreement with that company. And that's as a result of what happened after that in terms of the financial stability of Northvolt.
Thank you. In that same context, what was your role in the deal between the federal government and the $5 billion Stellantis LG joint venture plant in Windsor?
Oh, it was similar than
very similar. In terms of, could you repeat your specific role in that again?
Like I said, my team and I are supporting the policy assessment of the automotive sector, including the battery sector.
Okay, and given that the government promised to pay Stellantis up to $529 million, $268 million of which had already been paid out, what protections did you actually negotiate into this agreement? And even if it was just policy advisement, what protections were there?
I'm not in a position to answer that question, unfortunately, at the moment. There's a lot of commercially sensitive information and agreement between the government and a company like this, and I certainly don't have it in front of me at the moment.
But to your recollection, did you advise any policies in terms of protection, in terms of this $5 billion commitment?
Absolutely. There's always some protection negotiated with companies like this. I will remind the member that this was 2022, if I recall, so it's a number of years ago. So,
But there was
Thank you very
some
much,
policy.
Mr. Ross.
Oh,
I will now turn to Mr. Grant for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. It's always great when a Olympic medal winning person is in the witness chair. I do follow my Olympic history, and I was watching Ms. Vanderkamp. Mr. Cauchi, transportation remains one of the largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions in Canada, and it is also a major driver of local air pollution in our communities. As outlined in the government's automotive strategy, we are moving away from prescriptive sales mandates and instead strengthening greenhouse gas emission standards described by the department as one of the strongest tools we have right now to support emissions reductions while giving industry flexibility. These standards are designed not only to reduce emissions but also to cut pollution that Canadians actually breathe every day, especially people living near busy roads, children and seniors especially. From ECCC's perspective, why is the light-duty vehicle sector such a critical focus for emissions reductions, and how do strengthened vehicle GHG standards contribute both to climate goals and to improving air quality and public health across Canada?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Grant. I think it's fair to say that transportation is the second highest emitting sector in Canada, so it is clear that we are not going to achieve our climate goals unless we do address emissions from the transportation sector, and light-duty vehicles are a major contributor to those overall sector emissions. Net zero by 2050 is obviously the end goal here, and while we also have interim targets along the way, we appreciate that there needs to be some flexibility and consideration given to the economic health of our manufacturing and import vehicle sector, and we are trying to take that into consideration as we develop regulations. You mentioned air pollution. I addressed that before. There are major air pollution gains associated with these regulations on top of existing air pollution controls for vehicles. So increased EV deployment in Canada will help to further decrease harmful air pollution for Canadians. So we will be seeing benefits. Not just social and health benefits, but we also see very important benefits for consumers. We know that an EV, for example, is about 40 to 50% less costly on maintenance and operations than an ICE vehicle, and so long term, while upfront costs may be higher, over the life cycle or the life span of a vehicle. In terms of total ownership, costs will be lower for consumers. So there is an economic gain as well for consumers. And then, of course, we see just really strong growth in the EV market globally. And if Canada is going to be a major player in the global auto sector, it will need to be part of that global transition. We have a lot of confidence in our ability to innovate and to make the cars that the world wants, and so we think that this policy also is complementary to those innovation and competitiveness objectives.
Mr. Cauchi, we've often heard the term range anxiety, and opponents often argue that electric vehicles are impractical outside major urban centers, despite growing evidence to the contrary. What data or analysis does ECCC rely on to assess the real-world viability of electric vehicles across different regions, including northern and colder climates and long-distance travel corridors in our country?
Appreciate the question. Yeah, certainly when you look globally at countries that have the highest EV adoption, those countries are actually Nordic countries. So we see countries like Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Iceland, the UK even, with very high adoption of EVs. So we think that this does show that that northern climates are not necessarily an impediment to EV sales, and quite to the contrary. We also see that the average Canadian does not drive more than 40 kilometers to and from their house in a day, and so while we do appreciate that range anxiety is a major barrier to increased EV uptake, that the statistics show that as more and more models become, come to market with greater range, and Canadians become more familiar with EVs, that those range anxieties will hopefully decrease over time.
Thank you very much. We will now turn to Monsieur Simard pour 2.5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Simard, you have 2.5 minutes. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, Mr. Couch, I didn't give you the opportunity to answer to my previous question. We'll fix that. So I liked what you told my colleague. You said clearly that if we don't address the issue of transportation, we won't be able to reach our GHG reduction targets. So I want to be clear about what I said earlier. If we remove a standard, if we had some predictions with a standard that led us to X decrease in emissions, I suppose you have predictions with the taking away that. It was supposed to be something like 360 megatons, so I suppose you have some projections. Could you provide to the committee a comparative table? Yes. Could you provide that to the committee? And could you show us how the new government policy will lead to decreasing GHGs in a major way? I'll give you time to answer now. Thank you for the question. We have to acknowledge that there was overlap between programs. There were 2 regulations for light-duty vehicles and also on the other side, the GHG performance standards. So we integrated, we combined those 2 regulations into one regulation in order to eliminate overlap. That's important. The modeling that we carried out indicated that our approach, announced by the Prime Minister, will realize more than 300 million megatons cumulatively by 2050. That's important. We have to make that more specific in the Canada Gazette publication in the months to come. Thank you. I know I don't have much time left. Maybe a small, quick request. If you can also provide the data that you have on the availability of vehicles with the standard and without the standard in writing, that would be interesting for the committee. Thank you very much.
Mr. Bexty for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. And but I had to behave and follow the rules and not touch it when. Welcome, witnesses. Thank you very much for your attendance today, and good day, colleagues. I have some questions. I would like to get some understanding about the decrease in zero-emission vehicle sales this year and what drove that. Perhaps Mr. Cauchi. So in 2025 to 2026, there was a 39% reduction in EV sales. And what is the mechanism?
Certainly talk about what we think is happening. I mean, obviously, no one has the full answer, and so, but certainly the data did show a decline in sales. We were at about 15% in 2024. We went to about 10.5% in 2025. I think I heard that StatsCan has just released the numbers for the first quarter of 2026, and they're up significantly. Not surprisingly, I think the price of gasoline obviously is going to have that impact, and obviously we're seeing as well the effect of the rebate program We certainly
So you're
saw
just, it was
rebate
the
program.
expiry of, and the uncertainty of all the programs?
So the expiry of the rebate program, I think we did see certainly an impact from that. We also...
Thank you. Maybe I'll pivot here a little bit. I wonder that there's some market saturation forces in effect here, right? That the demand uptake coupled with uncertainty of government policy and the geopolitical circumstance, we just haven't adapted anything well enough. But beyond that, if we have the aspiration to be a major auto exporter of EVs, how does this square with the fact that our major customer, which irrespective of what our aspirations might be in Asia or Europe, is the United States, and the demand there for imported EVs is not going to materialize? You know, how does that square?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to recognize that there's sort of an ebb and flow in what we see in supply and demand. And I take your point. I mean, we're not going to see a static situation. And I think certainly while policy signals south of the border are what they are, we're quite alive to the potential for that to shift. And we're also seeing, of course, the government's interest in trade diversification pretty clearly, including with the European Union, and certainly automakers are more and more interested in competing globally.
If I may, I know there's an interest there, but it's just not going to change the fact that the United States is geographically adjacent and is always going to be the major opportunity. Let's pivot again here a little bit to infrastructure and grid. We're starting to see from the testimony and the questions that there's kind of a paradoxical mismatch between supply, demand, where the infrastructure is, where the demand is, where the gaps are. Given that charging infrastructure depends on grid expansion, it's transmission and distribution in the rural long-distance travel, but it's the congestion in the urban interface. And instead at $1,500 for level 2 private chargers, where's the infrastructure money going to come from to fix that, especially with AI demand and new demands on the grid? We don't have the grid capacity to transmit. We don't have the capacity to distribute. We don't have the capacity to generate.
Maybe I'll just take that last question. Thank you very much for the question. We have certainly done, there's studies being done currently about the grid demands for charging. And all of the utilities across the country are planning for this, certainly, and the federal government is looking very closely at the electricity system to discuss that. However, I would note that with the opportunity to manage demand of charging across the country in the future, this is actually going to be a lot less of a problem than we think. The studies are coming out now to say that if we can control charging and have it, for example, when there aren't peaks overnight, then we're actually not going to create a lot of new demand.
Okay, peace. Let's go to the cost to actually install the equipment in homes. That $1,500 for a private charger, that's just the charger, but not the panel upgrade from a 60 amp, 100 amp, 200 amp service in a home, let alone the new transformers in all the neighborhoods all over the place. What is the cost of that going to be?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Certainly, the $1,500 is the installed cost. Generally, if there is an additional requirement on your panel, that will be a small additional cost, but the cost savings eventually will outweigh
that. A panel upgrade is a huge expense.
It can be sufficient, but again, I want to note that folks are looking with demand management an opportunity to stay within the panel cost.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bexty. Maintenant, je tourne à Monsieur Saint-Pierre pour 5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
And now, Mr. Saint-Pierre, you have 5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Thank you for being here, witnesses. Mr. Cauchi, in February, when the strategy was announced, there was a lot of support from ecologists, Clean Energy Canada, Electric Mobility Canada, or the Pamiyan Institute. Why do you think that ecologists were in favor of this automobile strategy? To my mind, there's an acknowledgement of the importance of combining both priorities for the encouraging the automobile sector while we progress with reducing GHG emissions. So, to my mind, that was the principal cause.
Environmental groups recognize the importance of electric vehicles to the transition and to Canada's net zero goals. And I think they saw in the government's approach a nice balance between, a technology-neutral, flexible regulation, a reduction in red tape associated with having two regulations in place rather than one, while at the same time clear targets for EV deployment and a grams per mile approach that would not only incentivize EVs but would actually reduce greenhouse gases from internal combustion vehicles as well as hybrids as well. So I think recognizing that maybe a sales mandate of just focusing on battery electric vehicles, for example, on its own would not necessarily drive the same reductions from other parts of the fleet. I think that's an environmental win. And I think the environmental community broadly recognizes that, the moment we're in and the importance of that approach.
Merci. Et si c'est possible, est-ce que vous pouvez...
Thank you. And if possible, could you give us articles in the media where these environmental groups supported this strategy?
To the community, to the committee, we'd be happy to do that. Pas de problème.
Puis aussi, le Premier ministre de l'Ontario.
And as well, the Prime Minister of Ontario and many representatives of the industry in Ontario and elsewhere in Canada were quite positive about this announcement. Could you explain why many different stakeholders were in favor of this?
Il y avait beaucoup de critiques concernant le...
There was a lot of criticism about the existence of two regulations. I think the Ontario Prime Minister was clear about this situation.
There was a preference in some provincial capitals for, and notably Ontario, for kind of a streamlined regulatory approach that would reduce the administrative burden on industry and support competitiveness. Certainly, that was pretty clear from the Premier of Ontario. We do see, though, other provinces, including Quebec and BC, who have obviously maintained their approach to sales mandates, and I guess that fits nicely with what the federal government is doing. We did hear some concerns that the previous regulation was also duplicating provincial ones. That is no longer the case, and so there is some complementarity with what is happening at the provincial level.
Perfect, thanks. And maybe I'd ask if you can also provide any media articles or anything that shows that there was other sector support for the strategy. That'd be appreciated. Monsieur Tessier, il me reste une minute, donc je veux poser une question sur...
I have 1 minute left, so I'd like to ask you a question, Mr. Tessier, on 1.5 billion, and tell you where we are according in the schedule, and when there will be loans that will be coming into effect. So loans for Canadians.
Puisque c'est la responsabilité de ma collègue,
je vais déléguer la question à Mme Vanderkamp.
My question is for Ms. Vanderkamp.
$5 billion from the Canada Infrastructure Bank is already in play, that they are committing their funds currently already. They've committed $630 million already to charging across the country. And so if I understand the question, that is an active file for sure right now. Their focus at the Canada Infrastructure Bank's program is on actual fast public charging. Revenue generating, so really trying to bring in the private investment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As we have witnesses for a full 2 hours, I'm going to suspend for 5 minutes for a quick health break if you want water, coffee, etc., and then we will resume. Thank you. 5 minutes is tough. Okay, so we are going to start on round 2 with Mr. Leslie for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The government says, and I quote, "A large percentage of EVs will be required by all companies to meet the standard over time," end quote. And that's from the Backgrounder as part of the news release, the new plan. To me, that sounds like the same old Liberal EV mandate plan with a new coat of paint. So what is that percentage?
Yeah, so the government has been clear on the targets that it wants to achieve. So the target of 75% EV sales by 2035, and I think an aspirational target of 90% by 2040. And of course, that's consistent with a long-term trajectory getting to net zero.
So the 75%, that's based on today's market? Is that a best case scenario? Is that just a random number picked?
Yeah, that's coming from a decision made based on a variety of variables informing decision making.
So you've done modeling to suggest that based on the current trajectory and the subsidies as planned for the next, unclear if it's 4 or 5 year plan that's been outlined here, that's what we can expect to get to?
So there are a variety of things in play here. So you mentioned the subsidies. So yeah, the rebate definitely is factored in. We're definitely seeing in that the technical feasibility piece.
So you're confident that this is what's going to happen?
Supply demand issues.
Like that, we're going to get 75% adoption. That's going to happen.
So that is the target the government that the government has announced.
Okay. I mentioned modeling, and you alluded to it previously regarding GHG emissions reductions modeling. I'm hoping you can table with the committee the modeling that was done under the previous electrical availability standards, the mandate, and the modeling that has been done under the new plan, side by side, so we can see the difference on a year-by-year basis as to how many emissions will be reduced for both of the plans. Can you do that?
So the government is going to be publishing in the Canada Gazette that modeling with the proposed regulation. So that modeling will be dependent on the parameters that are set in the regulation. So
will that include the modeling that was done
Yes.
for the previous? So it'll be side by side?
There will be a comparison of previous modeling and new modeling. Yeah.
When is that going to happen? And is that typical for the Gazette process?
Yeah, that is part of the RIAS, the regulatory impact analysis statement that is a requirement of any federal regulation that goes before the Governor and Council is going to and has included the cost benefit associated with any regulation, and so that will be the case in this case, and we do intend to publish later this year in the Gazette. Will
you also be publishing, there's been a lot of talk about air pollution and deaths from some Health Canada reports. Will you be tabling modeling on the number of deaths that could be prevented under the electric vehicle availability standard previous and the new model?
So I think that's maybe a question more for Health Canada, but we'll
contact them and have them provide whatever is possible?
Yeah.
I'd like to go back to, you mentioned the RIAS there. How much does the department expect the new tailpipe regulations under this new plan to raise the price of new vehicles in Canada?
So I think one of the criticisms that we saw of the previous approach was the impact on vehicle prices, and certainly that was a major issue raised during the EVAS review. We did, as you know, a national review. We will see, and Canadians are experiencing this now, we see vehicle prices increasing because of tariffs, et cetera, et cetera. It's not just EVs. It is general.
I understand.
And so
how much, just on for this policy, what do you expect prices to go up by based on this policy alone?
Yeah, that will be published in the Canada Gazette as well.
So you do know that right now?
Well, so we are dependent on parameters. So if I'm not in a position to give you, for example, interim stringency values, numeric values, so that would determine what the.
But so when the announcement was made, there was no understanding of what the impact would be on prices?
No, that's not true. So we know that there would be a reduction in costs associated with this policy, and certainly the auto sector.
You knew there would be an increase in prices?
To that effect.
That was known?
The auto sector has
provided,
been fairly clear, I think, even in the media, about the costs associated with the previous regulation. It sought the approach the government has announced to reduce costs, and those I believe they did table some anticipated costs associated with the EVAS, and we've definitely taken that under advisement.
Okay. As of right now, how many Canadian EVs are on the market that can take advantage of the full rebate as of today?
I think that's probably a question for our colleagues at Transport Canada who manage the rebate program.
If you could get back to us.
Yeah,
now, I noticed that the rebates are declining. They start at 5,000, and by 2030, they're down to 2,000. Why is the sliding scale of cuts happening on the rebate side?
Yeah, so again, I think that's probably a question for our colleagues at Transport Canada who manage that program. But I mean, I think we can say that price parity is an important factor here as well. And as we see EV prices gradually come down over time, and there's some evidence to show they are coming down.
But is it rock solid evidence? Like, we don't know that.
Whether the rebates are needed at certain levels is something that they can probably address for you.
Has the department done any estimates on the average household income of people that are expected to receive this rebate over the next 4 years?
So that kind of distribution analysis would be something you need to talk to Transport Canada about the rebate. Unfortunately, they're not here. So.
Okay. I think we should have another meeting because I have many other questions in this space regarding what the impact is going to be in terms of who's going to get these rebates. Because at the end of the day, unless price points go down, unless we bring in a whole bunch of cheap Chinese EVs, most people that are going to buy these vehicles are going to already be able to buy them.
Thank you, Mr. Leslie. I'll now turn to Mr. Greaves for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for sticking around. I'm going to pick up exactly where my colleague left off, actually. As we're aware, the Prime Minister and the government have recently negotiated tariff relief with China that allows for a certain number of Chinese-made EVs to enter the Canadian market. And I'd just like to give you the opportunity to elaborate perhaps on the details of that, specifically with this focus on making lower-cost EVs available to Canadians. Can you speak to how many and what the anticipated price point of those new EVs in the Canadian market will be? Perhaps Monsieur Tessier.
Thank you very much for the question. So obviously, the partnership agreement with China is a responsibility of the Global Affairs. So I can summarize essentially what was published in terms of this negotiation. But as you point out, the 49,000 quota that was accorded to China was accompanied with a low-price EV reserve. So it's expected that within the next 5 years, 50% of those EVs coming from that country will be below $35,000. Mm-hmm.
50% of the EVs that have been permitted under the recent agreement, do you have any reason to think there might be more EVs made available in future that would increase the availability of lower-cost EVs for Canadians?
Well, absolutely. I think naturally EVs have been going down. The price of the batteries, the technology improvements, all of this made EVs cheaper across the globe, including in Canada, and they continue to go down. So absolutely, that will also continue in the next 5 years for sure.
Okay, thank you. So we've heard today and in previous meetings from our colleagues, concerns around affordability, concerns around whether or not EVs are essentially a luxury good that won't be available to everyday Canadians, to middle-class families. We know this isn't true. We know that much of the rest of the world is already transitioning towards EVs. We know that more than half of the vehicles sold in the world last year were electric vehicles. So we know that there is incorrect information that has been circulating around this issue. I'm wondering if any of you could please speak to what we might be able to do, what the government might be able to do to communicate this information more clearly to Canadians about the savings associated with transitioning towards EVs. Is there a strategy in place to communicate how much the annual household savings might be, as we previously discussed, Ms. Vanderkamp, or the increasing affordability of the EVs entering the Canadian market? Can we get this information to Canadians to help dispel some of the half-truths that are out there?
Maybe I could take that question as I am responsible for education and awareness for EVs. So the federal government certainly has a ZEV hub in which we are publishing this information, but I would also say very importantly that we are supporting organizations across the country that are the trusted sources for Canadians on this matter and are actually on the ground. So We have funded over 100 projects across the country on education and awareness with respect to EVs for a variety of different topics and decision makers. So we're definitely doing that already. And part of the National Charging Infrastructure Strategy, one of the main pillars of that is going to be education of Canadians, businesses, and workers.
Okay. And thank you for that, and great to hear that this is something that falls under your responsibilities at NRCan. Would that information and communication campaign also include some of the information you shared earlier in terms of the availability of charging stations, making people aware that in most instances they actually live in communities that are served by these kinds of infrastructure, that similarly that would be information useful for Canadians to have access to?
Yeah, thank you very much. We certainly do want to make that more apparent to Canadians. We have a national charging locator map already that's public for Canadians that has every public charger available in Canada there for folks to see, plus there's several other companies that provide that information as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. How am I doing for time, Madam Chair?
You have another minute and a half.
Wonderful, plenty of time, thank you. I think perhaps back to Monsieur Tessier, the question around what does failing to transition towards a cleaner economy and a cleaner industrial sector mean for Canada's international competitiveness, I think is a large one that touches on many different issues, but is certainly relevant here as well. We've heard suggestions, of course, that Canada shouldn't or cannot get out of alignment with the United States, but given the current circumstances in the United States, I would hope that it's an aberration that the U.S. government is not currently supportive of this transition, and that that's going to be a very difficult position for the United States to maintain going into the future. Can you speak briefly in our remaining time about what the risks to Canada are of not transitioning our own economy towards cleaner energy, towards lower emissions, at a time when that is what the overwhelming majority of the rest of the world is attempting to do?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for the question. I think I'll focus my answer on the economic perspective, because that's the mandate of the department I work in. Essentially, you're quite right to point to the fact that despite the fact that the Americans or the American administration has passed some policies that are limiting, I guess, the transition to electric and the EV sector, the rest of the world is clearly going the opposite direction. So it's certainly true in Europe. They're growing the number of EVs that they're selling in Europe, and it's true in other markets as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Et maintenant, je passe la parole à Monsieur Simard pour 6 minutes.
And now, Mr. Simard, you have the floor for 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Cauchi. I'm going to come back to you, and I would like to maybe change the request I made to you. Giving you a clearer picture. The former standard, 2035, 100% electric vehicles. The new one is 75% of electric vehicles in 2035. I'd like to know from your department, with the former standard, with 100% EVs, what was the GHG quantity and the impact on health? And the same thing with the new standard, 75% of EVs in 2035. What is the GHG reduction and the impact on health? Would you be able to provide this for the committee? Thank you for the question. I think that currently it's not available. It's being finalized. It's being developed to be published in the Canada Gazette. So I saw in an opening statement you made here in November, where you talked about the success in Norway on a standard that allows for more EVs. And what motivated here going from 100% with Mr. Guilbeault's standards to 75%? What explains that change? There were several factors that were taken into account after the national assessment on the availability of EVs. First of all, there was the factor of carbon pricing. And also then the cost of EVs was another factor. Not only at the federal level, but in provinces such as Quebec or BC, there was a re-evaluation of their standards and their mandate, and a decrease in adoption caused by these factors. So it's a bit what we were saying at the beginning. Well, we changed the standards because we had to support the automobile sector in a difficult situation. It's a rhetorical question. Also, the price of vehicles at that point meant that there was an increase in price for EVs for consumers, all vehicles, not just EVs, because of these tariffs that were imposed. So that was an important issue, not just for automobile manufacturers. So nothing to do with carbon pricing. Thank you. Ms. van der Kamp, I'd like to come back to the PIES program. So a conservative colleague says that it's very expensive to change the panel if we want to connect a charger. So for $45, I have an electrician friend who came to our house, and when my dryer works, our car doesn't charge, or if the car is charging, no dryer works. So it cost me $45, and a friend, I could recommend her to you if you want. Oh, also I offered her dinner. So are there still funds in the PILES program? I want to see the PHEV program that existed at National Resources, and the program with the new money from the Infrastructure Bank. What I understood was the Canada Infrastructure Bank is ready to spend money for projects that are worth at least $20 million. Does that mean projects of a smaller scale cannot go through the CIB? Will it still work through the PIVES? Will that be filled up by or increased by the government? Could you please tell me?
CIB so far is funding very large projects. We have a memorandum of understanding between our program and their program to talk about projects that are of interest to both organizations. So far, we have funded those that are less than 20 million. So we are talking. And I can say that the Zero Emission Vehicle Infrastructure Program has funding until the end of this fiscal year that we are still giving out.
Jusqu'à la fin de cette année.
Oui.
Mais pour la
Till the end of this year. Will the projects be sent back to the Infrastructure Bank, or will that other program still exist, Zero Impact?
There is no commitment right now. The Infrastructure Bank's funding really is focused on those that are appropriate for concessional financing, and that is of a certain type, and our program has a different focus. So I can say right now that the National Charging Infrastructure Strategy is looking at the tools that are available. I would maybe also note that there are a few other tools that we have. The Clean Fuels Regulations. As a compliance to the Clean Fuels Regulations, companies could generate funds for investments in charging.
Merci beaucoup.
Oui, merci.
Now,
Thank you very much.
5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And it always jumps out at me that it's always urbanites telling everybody in rural Canada that it's okay and suitable for rural Canada to actually use EVs when it's not really practical or affordable for that matter, not even safe in some matters, because that's not what my constituents tell me, where we have to drive long distances just to get services. The 40-kilometer rule in terms of range anxiety, I agree, but not when you got to drive 1,000 kilometers where there's no charging stations. It's just not practical. So, Mr. Cauchi, you've answered this already to some of my colleagues' questions, So what about Canadians in rural, remote, and northern communities like those in my riding, Skeena-Bulkley Valley, who don't have the option of switching to an EV? How does this new auto strategy ensure the affordability and availability of internal combustion engines for people in regions such as mine who don't have practical access to EVs?
Thank you for the question. Happy to give a reply. The current approach will allow internal combustion engine vehicles and conventional hybrids to still be sold, albeit it's expected that they'll be sold in lesser amounts, but they will be available for purchase. Oftentimes, we see a fixation in some communities about sort of the assumption that only battery electric vehicles will be the future. That is not the case. The regulation will allow for plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, for example, to be used. These are dual engine vehicles that would allow rural Canadians to use their gas engine when they need to for long distances.
In case of my constituents in rural Canada, we're concerned about the price of combustion vehicles, where you push the price of a combustion vehicle so high that my constituents have no choice but to buy a second-hand combustion vehicle. We still have that market.
Yeah,
and the range anxiety is real. I mean, to visit one of my communities, I've got to drive 1,000 kilometers into the Yukon and then drive back down into the community. And I've heard people that have, for some reason, their battery gives out. And in the wintertime in the north, minus 30, minus 40 degrees and an isolated highway, this becomes a safety risk, not just the affordability. So how can I go back and tell my constituents that they'll be okay in terms of affordability, availability, and safety when we're talking about this new vehicle policy coming out of the federal government?
Yeah, so, I mean, I think it's pretty clear right now that ICE vehicles are roughly about 70% of sales in Canada today. We see increasing numbers of conventional hybrid vehicles. I think 17% of the latest numbers, like very high uptake of conventional hybrids. We see also plug-in hybrids. Those vehicles will be in place. I mean, to speculate what the vehicle market looks like in 2045, when we know the rest of the world is moving to EVs,
2045 is way beyond. My issue is affordability, safety, and availability. That was my question. But Madam Chair, I'd like to turn my reign time over to my colleague.
Thank you. And I'd really just like to pick up from where he left off, because the dynamics of my riding in Newfoundland and Labrador are extremely similar to what he's describing, but more with respect to the charging infrastructure. And you talked about 50 to 60 kilometers as being average that a rural resident would drive, but that's way below what we see in my constituents driving in the northern parts of my riding. So what do you say in terms of how does this policy address people outside of those average distances for traveling in terms of charging infrastructure?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I thought I said 60 to 70, and that may be in your riding low. I would say that certainly we have seen the ranges. It's a combination of the ranges getting better all the time, and the fact that public charging is getting better as well in these long distances. In your area of the woods right now, you can go from Corner Brook to St. John's with fairly good service across. You can even get up to Gross Mourne, but after that, it's getting tricky.
Well, yeah, that's exactly the area of my riding that I consistently go back to, because that's where I get a lot of feedback. So just to pick up on something else, you talk a lot of talk around plug-in hybrids as the great option for people who are living in rural and remote. So why then did you only offer a $2,500 rebate for plug-in hybrids as opposed to $5,000?
A quick answer, please.
I mean, I think that's for Transport Canada. That's not our program, so I think that's fair to say.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. I'll now turn to Mr. St. Pierre for 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you. I'll pick up on that. So, Mrs. Anstey, your constituents must be really excited, or as my colleague Champagne would say, there's really good news for your constituents, because the $1.5 billion loan program from Canada Infrastructure Bank will actually help out a lot of folks living in remote regions. My mom was just in town recently. She lives in Northern Ontario. It's about a 7-hour drive from Ottawa. And I go there 2-3 times a year with my electric vehicle, and I'm able to charge along the way. So I do it when it's minus 30. Puis comme mon collègue il sait, on a beaucoup de voitures électriques en Est.
And as my colleague knows, we have a lot of electric vehicles in the eastern townships, Lanaudière, Montreal, and to Ms. Vanderkamp's point, it's a question of affordability on économies.
It saves me a lot of money, and it's an affordability measure. So, Mr. Cauchi, I'll ask you a question maybe around the emission standard. So EVAS has been replaced by the emission standard. Can you explain to this committee why this new emission standard will first reduce emissions in the transportation sector? Maybe give us a quick overview of the greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector and how this new standard will help address that important part of our climate agenda. And secondly, I'd like you to elaborate a little bit more on the figures of expanding EV sales by 75% by 2035 and 90% by 2040. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, happy to expand some of our thinking. So the existing greenhouse gas performance standards for light-duty vehicles, as mentioned, they've been in place for some time. These are performance-based standards. They're technology neutral, so they're based on OEMs bringing to market increasingly more efficient vehicles, including electric vehicles, conventional hybrids, plug-in hybrids, more efficient ICE vehicles, et cetera. The basis of that regulation is essentially a sales-weighted fleet average. So each company will have the ability to manage its own average. There are a number of flexibilities in that regulation, including the ability to trade credits, to buy and sell credits, to bank credits, compliance credits. Moving forward, there are also there historically have been some other compliance credits, including for off-cycle issues to allow greater flexibility for innovative technologies. We're in the process of exploring kind of what that regulation, what the Canadian sovereign regulation that will move forward will contain. So we're not ready to divulge that. But certainly that will be published in the Canada Gazette in the coming months and will show Canadians exactly what the government is thinking in terms of the structure of the regulation. But suffice it to say that we've seen improvements in vehicle efficiency and emissions from individual vehicles in a substantial way since the government first published these regulations in 2011. So we see about a 53% improvement in cars and about a 38% improvement in light truck performance as a result of these regulations. And as we double the stringency moving forward, we'll see even greater improvements and lower greenhouse gas reductions.
Great, thank you very much. And Mrs. Vanderkamp, so you mentioned earlier the EV subsidy program, the $2.3 billion. Can you quickly elaborate how many Canadians will benefit from this program? How many Canadians do you anticipate will be able to purchase a new EV? And can you share some details on whether Canadians have already started to benefit from this program?
I can definitely speak to the programs that support chargers. So the $1.5 billion from the Canada Infrastructure Bank is going to get probably about, as I understand from their officials, about 10,000 public chargers. But just to be clear, those are public, mostly fast chargers. The Zero Emission Vehicle Infrastructure Program has supported about 54,000 chargers, and those are, for the most part, about for level 2. About almost half of those are for multi-unit residential buildings, and so that is 30,000 Canadians that have more charging directly. We also support public charging, level 2 and level 3, and many Canadians are going to benefit from those being in convenient places.
Okay.
Is that helpful?
Yeah, thank you. Am I out of time? Or okay.
Thank you, Mr. Saint-Pierre. Maintenant, Monsieur Sinimal pour 2.5 minutes.
Now, Mr. Simon, you have 2.5 minutes. Thank you very much. I want to continue to break myths. I live at 600 kilometers here, and I can do it in an electrical vehicle. And when I'm lucky, it takes me 10 minutes to charge. I have an assistant who needs me to stop it for washrooms often because she has to stop at every 300 kilometers for a break. So if we could our problem is only those people, well, we would, if it weren't for these people, we would be even more efficient. But technology is advancing very quickly, and there's no problem for someone who lives at 650 kilometers away to go to their destination with an EV. It works very well with the fast charging. The issue that persists for many Quebecers and Canadians is to have access to vehicles at a reasonable price. And in that case or situation, Canada is far behind. Why is it possible in Europe to have access to many types of vehicles under $40,000, and that doesn't exist in Canada? In your strategy, did you think about the fact that if we don't insist that builders go to 100% in 2035, they have less of an incentive to build vehicles at a lower cost? Did you think about access to vehicles at lower cost in your strategy? Yes, of course. We considered all of these points. It's very important to see the to consider the import sector, European or Asian vehicles from South Korea, for example. There was the announcement by the Prime Minister about Chinese electric vehicles. It's been part of our analysis, yes, and we hope that we will have a future market based on less expensive vehicles, on more affordable vehicles, and that will be also better conditions for the OEMs. So when you came to the committee earlier, when the Prime Minister had dropped the standard of 100% by 2035, you said there would be consultations. Are those consultations finished, and can you tell us what happened then? The consultations announced by the PM in September 2025 took place over 60 days, and it was about the standards on the availability of EVs, and we received 35,000 submissions from stakeholders, from Canadians, from... Thank you very much for this answer. We now have to proceed to the next.
Please.
5 minutes. Thank you very much, Chair. I appreciate that. I was thinking 2.5, so we got all kinds of time to run down different rabbit holes. Where to begin? I think we're all susceptible to pursuing fallacies, right? And, the Scandinavia fallacy is a northern climate. It's northern latitudes, but affected by the Gulf Stream. It's a very different climate. What I want to kind of look into a little bit more here is the ring fence piece part cost that has been discussed, right? That the car is cheap, right? And under $30,000, it's going to be great. But that's an analysis in isolation. And as you scale that out to society-wide application, the interference with all of the other parts, the distribution, the generation, the road maintenance, all the other stuff, right? Where's the analysis that's been done on that? Ms. Vanderkamp, could you comment on that? So charging infrastructure, cost at scale. So we're redoing whole cities to apply, to provide enough electricity to all the residential units, and generating and transmitting. Has that cost analysis been done?
I would say that some cost analysis has been done. in the years past, we're going to do a study on the national charge, an assessment over this next year of the new situation that we have from a regulatory perspective, demand generated by programs, to take a look at the potential requirements for the grid. That assessment's being done again, given the new understanding.
Is it currently underway now, or is it
We're just starting the process right now, yeah.
When do you anticipate that report will be complete?
By the end of the year.
Will it be public?
Yes.
Can I just jump in?
Yeah.
So when the government announced in 2023 the electric vehicle availability standard, it did also publish a forecast of the impact on the grid, and so I think the results were roughly a 9.5% increase in expected electricity demand by 2050. That assessment will obviously need to be updated. But because most, as Anna mentioned earlier, most charging is happening overnight in Canada in households when we have more surplus
This illustrates my point exactly. I'd like to interrupt you right now in that, my time, so please. Yeah. Even though that charging is happening at night, the capacity in the panel in the house and the transformer in the neighborhood and the substation at the edge of the city all have to be there to build it, to run it all at once, right? Is that cost been anticipated in all of this, that incremental cost?
If I could take that question, if that's okay.
Please, yes.
Yes, for sure. The considerations about the peak demand and what that might mean for generation capacity, et cetera, in each province by each utility is being undertaken for sure.
Generation, distribution, transmission,
yes,
and residential upgrades?
Yes, absolutely.
I appreciate my colleague from the block discussing that. If he could give me the contact information of the $45 electrician to come and do a panel upgrade, I would. Yeah, I got all kinds of work for him to do. Because he's talking about work that costs me thousands of dollars right now at the farm, including parts, labor, transportation.
If I could just say, though, that this idea of demand management is going to be critical for utilities for a bunch of different reasons, including electrification. And in fact, vehicle to grid eventually will be a solution actually that might generate revenue for Canadians.
I'm familiar with the notion, right, of smart metering and back and forth, right, and at-home batteries in the car. I get it, right, but we have not done the analysis of at-scale application. And I fear we're facing a fallacy that we're pursuing because we are looking at, a ring-fenced, isolated cost case and just adding it all up, think it's going to be fantastic. But we've got no analysis of the interference with all of the other parts in the system, a true systems engineering approach. Could you make some comments, please, anyone, related to how provinces are going to adapt much of the current road maintenance funding from their excise taxes on fuel, gasoline and diesel? Where's that going to come from in an electrical vehicle market? Do you anticipate provinces are going to have to apply some taxation on electrical vehicles to pay for road maintenance?
And maybe just quickly, I think some are doing that now. So we see, I think in Alberta, for example, we see the Alberta government has brought in a tax on EVs.
Has that been included in any of the analysis so far?
All of that is being looked at, yeah.
Can you provide those reports, make sure anything current and as it emerges is provided to the committee?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say, and I'm being told to stop, so I will defer to the chair.
Please provide them to the committee. Thank you, Chair.
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you, Mr. Bexty. Mr. Fanjoy for 5 minutes.
Thank you. If you'd like to finish your thought, please do so.
Thank you for that. I just say that obviously we're going to be publishing in Canada Gazette a full assessment of the regulation, a cost-benefit analysis, and at that time, some of the issues that are being discussed here will definitely be displayed for public consultation and discussed. And I think that analysis is ongoing, and so I think it would be premature for us to table things before they're fully completed. So.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Van der Kamp, I wanted to ask you to elaborate on the point you brought up earlier about multi-residential buildings and the difficulty having access to personal chargers there. What are some of the options for solutions to that particular challenge?
Thank you for the question. Maybe I'll just start with respect to new buildings going in. There are several provinces that have actually looked at requiring EV charging. So when we get to new buildings, we hope that those will be built so that they're ready. But really, we have a big set of existing buildings in Canada, and there are a few things there. When you can do retrofit at scale, then you actually have a lot of cost savings for the owner of a condo, for example. I would also say that there are several programs in the provinces with the highest EV adoption, Quebec and BC, to support condos and apartment buildings with the costs of renovating, including also our program and Zero Emission Vehicle Infrastructure program for that. Finally, I would say that actually there's a really interesting new business model because of, as I mentioned, the clean fuels regulations allows for some revenue generation. You can actually, there is a Canadian company making manufacturing here in Canada that is paying their customers 3 cents a kilowatt for their charging use because they actually are generating credits and passing that on to the consumer as a savings, and they offer those chargers for free. So there are new models and opportunities that are available to make this problem a little less daunting, but it certainly will be a big lift.
Okay. I think, and we've seen it here today, that amongst my conservative colleagues, there's a great focus on the upfront cost of an electric vehicle. I agree with them that it would be nice to see more lower cost options there, but not enough attention is on the total cost of ownership. And Mr. Greaves talked about $2.15 per liter. Your assumptions were 150 cents per liter. With electricity in many jurisdictions across Canada, overnight charging can be done at ultra low rates that are roughly 1/10 of peak electricity rates. How do we get that message across to more Canadians?
Really good question and a good point. So, and certainly we're living through high gas prices right now in the country, and certainly, the situation in Ukraine previously had created some volatility in oil and gas prices globally, and those oil and gas prices are set globally in Canada. So, every time, despite our abundance of oil and gas, we are oftentimes a price taker. And so what we see happening, though, is in the clean energy space, whether it's EVs or clean electricity, certainly many kind of leading countries, industrialized countries, are certainly trying to promote energy security through clean electrification, and that is not just obviously good for climate change, but it is an economic imperative, and it's certainly helpful in reducing prices on households. And I think the Climate Change Institute has recently published something called the Energy Wallet Study, which shows that purchasing an EV and electrifying a household can save families considerable money, not just in times like we're living through now, where we see volatility in the markets on oil and gas, but on a consistent basis over the long term. Certainly, clean energy solutions like EVs can certainly play a key role in energy security in Canada.
Okay, and I'll open this up to all of you. I'm not sure who might be the best person to answer it, but there's on the horizon. There is the potential to tap into electric vehicle batteries to add capacity to the grid. To provide backup power to homes, and this is really transforms an electric vehicle. We often make the mistake of thinking that an electric vehicle is just powered differently from an ICE vehicle, when that is not the case at all. I want to know what the government is doing to advance vehicle to grid technology and options in Canada.
Mr. Frange, I'm sorry you're out of time. Perhaps a 10-second reply?
Natural Resources Canada has programs that are supporting those types of projects across the country that are starting to look at those processes and abilities. Thank you.
Hey.
Thank you. So we have a few minutes remaining. Resources can go until 10 after 1. If the committee would like to continue with a few more questions, we could do 3 minutes per party, or we could adjourn early. 3 minutes. Is everyone amenable to doing 3 minutes per party? And then we'll finish? Okay. Wonderful. So we will go to Ms. Anstey for 3 minutes, please. Oh, Mr. Leslie?
Ms. Anstey's not feeling as well as some of the days she's here. I'd like to ask a rather specific question. Class 8 trucks are built mostly in the United States. If Canada goes out of alignment with American emissions rules, we risk fewer trucks in Canada and higher freight costs, higher prices for Canadians. Why is the government flirting with a policy disaster that will make it even harder and more expensive to move goods?
In this particular case, the light-duty vehicle regulations will not address heavy-duty vehicles, so those are separate regulations. These regulations will only look at the light-duty fleet, so light trucks, and in some cases, obviously cars and medium-duty vehicle, but not heavy-duty trucks. So the Class 8s, I think that you're referring to.
So
that's a separate.
The plan is never to include them.
We do have heavy-duty GHG regulations. They're separate from these regulations. Those have been in place since 2014, those are an announcement has not been made around their status. They remain in place in Canada, we see compliance with those regulations. From OEMs, and so
was there a different question? Was there ever modeling done on how many EVs were anticipated to be sold in that experience that we had where there was no rebates in place at the federal level versus with rebates? Like, what is the difference in sales expected to be?
I think we would have to refer that to our colleagues at Transport.
That's a transport question.
They are responsible for that.
Well, I would like to go back to the question I asked earlier. Regarding the quote from the backgrounder document that says, again, larger percentage of EVs will be required by all companies to meet the same standard over time. So my question is not what the aspirational target of 75% or 90 by 2040 is. What is that requirement? Because that, to me, indicates that there is something in the agreement, or at least has been projected to the industry, that there is a requirement of a certain percentage of EVs that have to be manufactured.
Yeah, so this is not a sales mandate. It will be a grams per mile.
I didn't say sales mandate.
Yeah.
I said manufactured mandate.
A manufacturing mandate.
The word required is clearly deliberate.
Right now, this is we're dealing now with a pollution regulation, so it's an emissions, sales-weighted emissions regulation.
So why in the backgrounder with it that's supposed to be, I assume, accurate for starters, but detailed, use the word specifically, a larger percentage of EVs will be required, not hoped and dreamed that they might get built, required by all companies to meet the standard over time. So there must be a clear plan of what that is. So I'm curious, what is that percentage?
Yeah, I mean, the government has laid out the percentage of 75. Its target is 75% EV sales.
So why is that?
By 2025.
That's a target, but this is very clear, required. So I asked about the mandated regulations, whether they're repealed or not. They have not, but I certainly hope they are. Yeah. But to me, this seems like a mandate by a different approach. The word required in the government document indicates that it's clear there is a plan to mandate from the manufacturer side, not the sales side necessarily like the old plan, that a certain percentage of vehicles be manufactured as EVs in Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Leslie. We will now move to Mr. Greaves for 3 minutes.
Madam Chair, and just before asking my question, I would just like to set the record straight because the model of Norway has come up several times in our meeting today. And the reason for that, of course, is that Norway leads the world in EV adoption. 97% of vehicles sold in that country last year are electric vehicles. And one of our colleagues did suggest that it was a fallacy to compare Norway to Canada for a variety of reasons. And I'd like the record to show that that is not correct. The average December temperature in the community of Tromsø in North Norway is Tromsø in North Norway, very, very far north, I assure you, is 0 degrees Celsius. The average December temperature in Prince Rupert, British Columbia, is 5 degrees Celsius. The average winter temperature in Karasjok, North Norway, is minus 16 degrees Celsius. The average temperature in Smithers, British Columbia, is minus 11 degrees Celsius. Both those communities are in Mr. Ross's riding. So. So the point being that there is, in fact, no geographic nor climatological reasons why something that works in Norway would not work in northern Canada, and the fallacy is that our colleagues continue to insist otherwise. I understand the comparison to Norway is not favorable to our Albertan friends because it throws into contrast the way that resource wealth has been managed differently in those two polities, but let's try to stick to the facts, please, sir. May I ask our witnesses if there's any reason to believe that cold temperatures or remote northern distances are an insurmountable obstacle towards EV adoption in northern and remote communities in Canada?
So I think, like, certainly there are some impacts on battery performance associated with extreme cold weather. I think that's very well known, and most automakers will admit that. However, are they insurmountable? I don't think so. So when we look at the average experience in a country like Norway, you've cited, so Norway has spent a lot of time on public education around with northern communities and around sort of warming of batteries before charging in the morning in cold and extreme weather. They've done a number of pilots in northern Norway to kind of bring communities on board with that work and with an EV transition. We see Iceland has high EV sales as well. They similarly have made that happen. Sweden, Denmark, you can keep going on the list. So, is it insurmountable? I don't think it is. And I think we're seeing definitely technologies improving. We're seeing more familiarity with how to manage extreme cold weather.
Sorry, excuse me. Madam Chair, I
think
it's difficult to hear the witness, and our colleagues are not showing suitable respect to the witnesses in front of our committee today. I'd ask if we could have a few more seconds for the witness to complete his answer.
Thank you, Mr. Greaves. Yes, we will quiet down a little bit and have another 20 seconds. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say continue that cold jurisdictions with extreme winter weather are adopting EVs, and that's not to say that their experience is identical to ours in Canada, but certainly we do expect that there will be improvements in battery technology and certainly charging, availability of charging, et cetera. And there is no reason why an electric vehicle cannot be used at this time in a northern community if there is, if they're available and if there was charging there for them. So, we would just cite the international examples where that is the case.
Appreciate the response. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Et on finit avec Monsieur Simard.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Simard, you have the final 3 minutes. Thank you very much, Chair. Given you're here, Ms. van der Kamp, I'll take advantage of that to talk to you about the suspension of the gas tax. I saw in the past, for example, during COVID, where the oil companies were playing a bit on their refinery margins and we're moving with that, which in a way which doesn't necessarily correspond with the price of the barrel of oil. Do you have any measures in place to make sure that these 10 cents of the gas tax be not recovered and used by the oil companies in refining margins? Were there studies carried out on these effects? Thank you for the question.
To my colleagues at Natural Resources Canada, my expertise is in EV charging and not in the price of gas. So my apologies. If you would like, you could ask for specific, and I can come back to you with studies on that.
OK, mais vous n'avez pas d'indication là-dessus. Bon, pas de...
You don't have any thoughts about that? No problem. So maybe I'll go back to a funding program for urban buses and school buses that were electric. We have heard that the government is working at refinancing urban buses, but put aside the requirement for zero emissions in this case. Is that the case for the buses? No, that's not in our light-duty vehicle regulations. As I said, there are regulations on GHG reductions for heavy trucks, including buses. but it's a performance regulation in terms of emissions. But as you said, Infrastructure Canada has a program for subsidies of zero emissions buses, and that's an important part of our approach. So that's kept up, that funding of zero emission buses. I think you should ask the question about the funding of that program to our peers at Infrastructure Canada. And for the medium light vehicles program on last March 31st, the funding of these zero emissions vehicles was ended before the results became evident in Quebec. So for the builders of these these electric medium heavy vehicles no longer benefit from that form of support. Is that right?
So I can't speak to that.
Okay.
Désolé.
Merci.
Merci beaucoup. Merci.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all witnesses.
Question. Thank you, Madam Chair. There's a lot of questions deferred to transport, infrastructure at the end there. I'm wondering, transport probably, it turns out, should have been here today, but rather than ask for like another hour with just them, can we send questions to the clerk to have sent to transport to answer written and not waste more time, but have it be available to the study? There was, I don't know, at least a handful or more, and as well as I stopped on the ones that were clearly on the track of transport.
Yeah, I think that would be a question for the clerk or the analyst to respond to. Is that appropriate?
If members send me questions that they would like asked of government for written responses, then I would be pleased to reach out to the parliamentary affairs offices of those respective departments and convey the questions on behalf of the committee.
Okay, so I'll happily take that opportunity and send those in relatively short order. My hope is that A, they'll choose to answer them, and B, we can include them in the final report that the analysts will be putting together if they're of relevance, which I assume they will be.
Yeah, I don't see that as being an issue, and the intention of the questions is to get answers to inform the final report. So the analysts will take that under advisement. So thank you very much to our witnesses for your time today. We really appreciate it. Our next meeting will be Tuesday, the 21st of April at 3:30. I thank all of my wonderful committee members for a great meeting, and we are adjourned.